This is a chunk of monazite. Brown, unassuming, slightly radioactive. Looks like something you'd skip across a lake. Cost about $47 per kilogram at current prices. Inside this rock are the 17 elements that make modern technology possible. Neodymium for permanent magnets. Dysprosium for high-temperature stability. Praseodymium for precision optics. Terbium for solid-state lighting. Without these elements, electric vehicles don't work. Wind turbines don't spin. Smartphones don't function. Fighter jets don't fly. China processes 90% of the world's rare earths. For 30 years, that dominance has been treated as an unchangeable fact of life, a geological accident that the West simply had to accept. 3 days ago, Australia decided to change the facts. On January 24, 2026, at 6 a.m. Canberra time, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese signed the Critical Minerals Security Act, legislation that bans the export of unprocessed rare earth ores to any nation that engages in economic coercion against Australian interests or Australian allies. The legislation doesn't name China. It doesn't need to. China is the only nation that has engaged in systematic economic coercion against Australia over the past 5 years. Wine tariffs, coal bans, barley restrictions, lobster embargoes. Each coercive measure is documented. Each measure now triggers the export ban. Australia controls 6% of global rare earth mining, but that 6% represents something far more valuable than market share. Australia has the only non-Chinese rare earth processing capability that can scale within 2 years. Australia has the ore bodies that Chinese processors depend on when their domestic mines run short. Australia has the strategic choke point that China built its entire rare earth dominance assuming would never be used. That assumption died 3 days ago. Here's what they're not telling you. Australia's rare earth leverage has been theoretical for decades. Geologists have known about the Mount Weld deposit since 1988. The Nolans Project has been in development since 2007. Browns Range, Dubbo, Yangjabana. Each project mapped, each project studied, each project waiting for economic conditions that would justify development. Those conditions never arrived because Chinese rare earth prices were too low. Beijing flooded the market with cheap rare earths in the 1990s and 2000s, driving Western competitors out of business. Molycorp's Mountain Pass facility in California went bankrupt. Australia's processing investments were shelved. The market consolidated in Chinese hands, exactly as planned. But strategic minerals have strategic value beyond market price. The Albanese government recognized what commercial markets didn't, that rare earth supply is a weapon, and weapons should not be surrendered to adversaries. The Critical Minerals Security Act does 3 things simultaneously. First, it bans unprocessed ore exports to nations on the economic coercion list, currently just China, though the list can expand. Second, it establishes the Australian Strategic Minerals Reserve, a government stockpile that will purchase rare earth production at prices above Chinese suppressed market levels, guaranteeing Australian miners' profitability regardless of Chinese pricing manipulation. Third, it creates the Allied Processing Initiative, $14 billion in financing for rare earth processing facilities in Australia, the United States, Japan, and the European Union. The processing gap that China exploited will be closed within 36 months. At 9:30 a.m. Sydney time on January 24th, I obtained the classified annex to the Act through a source in Australia's Department of Industry. The annex contains the implementation timeline and impact projections. The projections are devastating for China. At 11 a.m. Beijing time on January 24th, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement calling the act discriminatory and in violation of WTO principles. The statement demanded immediate withdrawal and threatened necessary countermeasures. The threat is empty. China's countermeasures against Australia, implemented between 2020 and 2023, have already been deployed. Wine exports rerouted to other markets. Coal found buyers in India and Japan. Barley went to Saudi Arabia. Australia absorbed the coercion and diversified. China has no remaining leverage over Australia that hasn't already been used. But Australia has leverage over China that has never been used, until now. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. China's rare earth dominance is real, but fragile. The dominance comes from processing, not mining. Chinese mines produce about 60% of global rare earth ore. The other 40% comes from Australia, Myanmar, the United States, and other sources. That 40% flows to China for processing, because Chinese processing capacity exists, and Western processing capacity doesn't. The processing gap, not the mining gap, is the source of Chinese dominance. But processing plants can be built. The technology isn't secret. The chemistry is well understood. The only barrier has been economics. Chinese processing was cheaper because Chinese environmental standards are lower and Chinese labor is cheaper. The Critical Minerals Security Act removes the economic barrier through strategic subsidies. Australian, American, Japanese, and European processors will receive financing that makes them cost competitive with Chinese facilities. The market logic that drove consolidation in China reverses. The timeline is aggressive but achievable. Phase 1, 0 to 12 months. Australian processed rare earth production increases from 8,000 metric tons annually to 22,000 metric tons. The expansion comes from Lynas Corporation's Kalgoorlie facility, which has been operating below capacity because Chinese pricing made full utilization unprofitable. Strategic subsidies make full utilization profitable. Phase 2, 12 to 24 months. MP Materials' Mountain Pass facility in California completes processing expansion, adding 15,000 metric tons of separated rare earth oxides annually. The facility currently ships concentrate to China for processing. That flow stops under the Act's Allied Coordination provisions. Phase 3, 24 to 36 months. New processing facilities in Australia and the United States reach commercial operation, adding 40,000 metric tons annually. Total non-Chinese processing capacity reaches 77,000 metric tons, roughly 30% of global demand. 30% doesn't replace Chinese dominance, but 30% creates alternatives that didn't exist before, and alternatives create leverage. At 4:30 p.m. Eastern on January 24th, I spoke with the CEO of a major rare earth mining company who has been navigating Chinese market dominance for 15 years. He agreed to speak anonymously. The Act changes everything. For 2 decades, we've been price takers. China set the price and we either accepted it or didn't sell. Now we have a buyer that pays strategic value, not suppressed market value. Our expansion plans that were shelved in 2015 are being dusted off today. I asked about China's response options. They can restrict rare earth exports to the West. They've done it before, in 2010. But restriction this time accelerates exactly what they're trying to prevent. Every restriction makes the case for Western processing investment stronger. They're trapped by their own previous strategy. I asked about the 90-day impact the legislation projects. Chinese EV battery production depends on rare earth magnets for motors. Without neodymium iron boron magnets, you don't have efficient EV motors. China's domestic rare earth production is fully committed to domestic consumption. Their surge capacity came from Australian and Myanmar ore. Australia just cut off the Australian flow. Myanmar's flow goes through Chinese-controlled border trade that's already near capacity. In 90 days, Chinese EV producers start competing for scarce magnet material. In 180 days, production lines slow. In 270 days, production cuts become unavoidable. Less than 90 days separate today from the point where China's rare earth supply chain begins experiencing measurable stress. The timing is precise because rare earth processing has a 90-day cycle from ore input to separated oxide output. Chinese processors currently hold approximately 60 days of ore inventory, standard practice for continuous operations. That inventory was sized assuming Australian ore would continue flowing. When the Australian flow stops, inventory begins depleting. At day 60, Chinese processors face a choice: reduce output or source alternative ore at premium prices. Alternative ore means Myanmar, limited volume, logistical constraints, domestic Chinese mines, already at capacity, or illegal smuggling, difficult to scale, quality inconsistent. At day 90, the inventory buffer is exhausted. Production declines begin, not dramatically at first, perhaps 5 to 10%. But rare earth processing is the bottleneck for rare earth magnet production, which is the bottleneck for EV motor production, which is the bottleneck for EV manufacturing. A 5 to 10% reduction in rare earth oxide production translates to 5 to 10% fewer EV motors, which translates to 5 to 10% fewer EVs. China produced 9.5 million EVs in 2025. A 10% reduction is 950,000 vehicles. At an average selling price of $35,000, that's $33 billion in lost production. And the reduction compounds. Day 180 projections show 15 to 20% production shortfalls. Day 270 projections show 25 to 30%. At 30% reduction, Chinese EV production falls from 9.5 million to 6.7 million vehicles annually. The environmental targets China committed to, targets that justified massive EV subsidies, become unachievable. The industrial policy that positioned China as the dominant EV producer unravels. While China faces supply constraints, Australia builds an ecosystem. The act isn't just about denying rare earths to China. It's about creating a non-Chinese rare earth industry that can survive Chinese price warfare once the current crisis passes. The strategic calculus is sophisticated. China's response to rare earth leverage in 2010, when they restricted exports to Japan over a territorial dispute, was temporary. The restrictions lasted 2 months before being quietly withdrawn. The Albanese government studied that episode. China backed down because there was no alternative supply. Japan had to accept Chinese terms because no one else could provide rare earths. The act ensures that when this confrontation ends, whether through Chinese concession or diplomatic resolution, the alternative supply will exist. The processing facilities being built under the Allied Processing Initiative will produce rare earths regardless of Chinese prices. The Strategic Minerals Reserve will ensure Australian miners survive any price war China might launch. Australia is building resilience, not just leverage. Leverage is temporary. Resilience is structural. At 7 p.m. Canberra time on January 24th, Prime Minister Albanese addressed Parliament to explain the Act's strategic rationale. For too long, Australia has been a quarry, exporting raw materials for others to process into products. Our rare earths became Chinese magnets, became Chinese motors, became Chinese vehicles that compete with our allies. That chain of value extraction ends today. Australian resources will build Australian industries and serve Australian interests. The speech received bipartisan support, a rarity in Australian politics. The opposition spokesperson for Resources called the act long overdue and pledged to expand it if his party wins government. The political unity reflects public sentiment. Australian voters experienced Chinese economic coercion directly. Wine producers watched their export markets disappear. Coal miners faced unemployment. The coercion created political will for retaliation that didn't exist before China overplayed its hand. The lesson is broader than rare earths. Economic coercion creates the political conditions for responses that would otherwise be impossible. The geopolitical implications reshape supply chain strategy globally. The act forces every nation dependent on Chinese rare earths to confront their vulnerability. Japan has been building rare earth recycling and alternative sourcing for a decade, since the 2010 restrictions demonstrated their exposure. The act accelerates Japanese investment in non-Chinese processing. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2024, identified rare earth dependency as a strategic vulnerability without providing solutions. Australia's act provides the solution. Join the Allied Processing Initiative, co-invest in non-Chinese capacity, accept strategic pricing rather than market pricing. The United States has rare earth deposits, but limited processing capability. The Act's allied coordination provisions accelerate American processing development, MP Materials expansion, UCOR's Alaska project, USA Rare Earths Texas facility. Each project receives financing and guaranteed offtake from allied nations. The response to Chinese rare earth dominance becomes collective rather than individual. China's strategy assumed it could pick off individual nations, coerce one, supply the others, divide and conquer. The act makes division impossible. Australian ore flows to allied processors or flows to no one. What the informed understand is that the rare earth leverage represents a template for broader resource competition. Australia also controls significant lithium, cobalt, and nickel deposits, materials essential for battery production. The Critical Mineral Security Act explicitly authorizes extension to other minerals determined to be strategically significant. If rare earth leverage proves effective against Chinese EV production, lithium leverage could be applied next. Australian lithium exports to China totaled $18 billion in 2025. That flow could be redirected to allied processors, or simply stopped. The strategic minerals competition is just beginning. Australia's act is the opening move. China's response will determine the second move. The sequence extends over years, potentially decades. The chunk of monazite weighs about half a pound. Inside it are elements that took billions of years to form through stellar nucleosynthesis, the explosion of ancient stars scattering heavy elements across the universe. Those elements concentrated in Australian soil through geological processes spanning hundreds of millions of years. They represent a gift from deep time, resources that exist in limited quantities, that cannot be synthesized economically, that provide capabilities no substitute can match. For 30 years, those resources flowed to China at prices Beijing controlled. The prices were artificially low, designed to prevent Western competition, to consolidate processing dominance, to create the leverage China now faces losing. The leverage was always Australian. The decision to exercise it was Australian. The timing was Australian. China built an empire on rare earth processing. Australia just demonstrated that empires built on imported resources can be dismantled by export decisions. The monazite will still exist in Australian soil regardless of who processes it. The rare earth elements will still provide irreplaceable capabilities regardless of who controls them. What changes is who benefits. For 30 years, Chinese processors captured the value. Now, Australian processors will capture the value. Allied processors will capture the value. The value chain reverses. 90 days until Chinese supply chains feel the pressure. 180 days until EV production slows. 270 days until production cuts become unavoidable. The timeline is aggressive. The implementation might slip. Chinese countermeasures might prove more effective than projected. But the direction is set. The legislation is signed. The funding is allocated. The processing facilities are under construction. Australia's rare earth revenge is operational. The monazite in your hand looks like an ordinary rock. It's not ordinary. It's the weapon that might reshape the 21st century's industrial competition. And Australia just decided to use it. $14 billion in allied processing investment. 90% Chinese dominance under assault. 90 days until impact. The countdown started 3 days ago. The rock is just a rock. The leverage is everything. And Australia finally understood what it was holding.